The moment the screen failed to wake up, Evan Cole knew he had made a mistake opening his mouth. The conference room felt too bright, too exposed, like every overhead light had been angled directly at him. Cold air pushed steadily from the ceiling vent, but sweat still gathered along his spine under the thin blue dress shirt he had ironed at 6 that morning. Across the table, Mark Ellison watched him with quiet patience, not angry, not rushed, just waiting. It was worse than being interrupted, worse than being challenged. This was the look of a man who believed the ending had already been written. "You are telling this room our numbers are wrong." Mark's voice stayed calm, almost conversational, but the words settled heavy across the polished table. 6 people sat along the walls pretending to review their laptops. Nobody was actually typing. Evan could feel it, the shift in the air, the subtle lean of attention. He swallowed once, throat dry. "I am saying the warehouse logs do not match the quarterly report." His voice came out steadier than he felt. That surprised him. For a split second, nobody spoke. Then Mark gave a small breath of amusement through his nose. "That is a serious accusation for someone 6 months into the department." The words were clean, professional, and carefully placed to remind everyone exactly where Evan sat on the food chain. Heat crept slowly up the back of Evan's neck. He hated that his fingers had curled tight against the edge of the table. Hated that his body was already reacting like prey, even while his brain tried to stay calm. "I double-checked the data," he said. Mark leaned back in his chair, leather creaking softly. His posture was relaxed in a way that felt deliberate. "And you believe everyone else missed it?" Not a question, a trap, dressed like one. Evan's stomach tightened. For half a second, doubt slipped in. Ugly and fast, the kind that always showed up at the worst possible time. Because the truth was, he had asked himself that same question at 2 in the morning, 3 nights ago, while staring at his apartment ceiling. What if you were wrong? What if you misunderstood the adjustment codes? What if this is exactly how you burn your second chance? But the numbers had not changed. And now the room was waiting. "I believe the reports should be verified before the board review," Evan said carefully. There was a small shift near the window. Someone stopped pretending to type. Mark's mouth curved slightly. "You are bluffing." The words landed soft, but they landed. A slow pulse of heat spread across Evan's face. He could actually feel his heartbeat in his ears now, steady and loud and impossible to ignore. This was the moment, the ugly one. The one where people either folded or doubled down. And God, part of him wanted to fold. Because he knew exactly how this could end. He had lived through one bad exit already. Had stood in another office years ago while someone with a calm voice explained restructuring and role redundancy and all the other corporate phrases that meant pack your things quietly. Failure never really leaves your system. It just waits. But the warehouse logs were still wrong, still sitting in his files, still bothering him every time he tried to ignore them. Evan forced air slowly into his lungs. "I am not bluffing." The room went very still. Mark's eyes sharpened just slightly. Not enough for most people to notice, but Evan did. "Good," Mark said calmly. "Then show us." 6 heads lifted almost in unison. Now, every single person in the room was watching him. Evan turned towards his laptop, and that was when his stomach dropped. The screen was still black. For 1 full second, his brain refused to process what he was seeing. He tapped the trackpad. Nothing. A thin line of cold slid down the center of his back. "Come on," he muttered under his breath. He pressed the key again. The screen flickered, then froze. Across the table, Mark's fingers began a slow, patient tap against the wood. Not impatient, confident, like a man watching someone walk into their own mistake. Evan could feel the room starting to tilt away from him. That subtle corporate shift where people mentally step back before the fall happens. His mouth had gone dry, because the truth was brutal in its simplicity. If this screen stayed dark for 10 more seconds, he was finished in this room. Maybe in this department. Maybe in this company. His thumb pressed harder against the trackpad than necessary. The laptop fan suddenly kicked louder. The screen flickered again, and then, just as Mark's mouth began to curve into something dangerously close to a smile, the display burst to life, bright white, rows of numbers, and one very obvious mismatch sitting dead center on the screen. The tapping across the table stopped. Completely. For the first time since the meeting began, Mark Ellison did not look relaxed. 6 months before, the conference room went quiet. Evan Cole was standing in the parking garage of the Phoenix office building, staring at his reflection in the dark window of his car and trying to slow his breathing. It was his first day. The sun had not fully cleared the horizon yet, but the air already carried that dry Arizona warmth that settled into your clothes before 9 in the morning. His silver sedan ticked softly as the engine cooled behind him. One headlight was still slightly fogged from an old crack he never quite fixed. He adjusted his tie twice, then a third time. It still did not sit right. Normal people probably walked into new jobs without their chest feeling this tight. Normal people probably did not sit in their cars for 5 full minutes rehearsing how to introduce themselves to reception. But the last time Evan had walked into an office with a badge around his neck, he had walked out 8 months later carrying a cardboard box and pretending his hands were not shaking. Your position has been made redundant. Corporate voices always stayed calm when they delivered bad news. He pushed the memory down and finally stepped out of the car. Inside, the building smelled faintly like printer toner and burnt coffee. The lobby lights were too bright, the kind that made every surface look overpolished and slightly unreal. The receptionist smiled politely, but did not quite hide the fact that she had already answered the same question 10 times that morning. Name, department, temporary badge. Everything moved in smooth corporate rhythm. It should have felt reassuring. Instead, Evan felt like he was walking across thin ice. By the end of the first week, he had learned the basic survival rules of the department without anyone needing to say them out loud. Arrive early. Speak carefully. Do not create extra noise. Mark Ellison, the regional operations manager, ran the floor with quiet efficiency. He was not loud, not openly aggressive. But the way conversations shifted when he walked past told Evan everything he needed to know. People here respected results, and they noticed mistakes. So Evan kept his head down. He checked numbers twice, sometimes 3 times. Most evenings, he stayed 15 minutes later than necessary, not because anyone asked him to, but because the memory of that cardboard box still lived somewhere in the back of his chest. For the first 3 months, nothing unusual happened. Then the shipment logs started bothering him. It was small at first. One product line showing a slight timing mismatch between the warehouse scan and the quarterly summary. The difference was subtle enough that most people would have skimmed past it without a second thought. Evan almost did. Almost. But something about the pattern itched at the back of his brain. That night, he stayed late. The office nearly empty except for the cleaning crew moving quietly between cubicles. He pulled the raw warehouse data and ran a manual comparison. The numbers did not line up. Not dramatically, just enough to feel wrong. His first instinct was simple. You are tired. You misread it. He closed the file and went home. But the next week another mismatch appeared. Different warehouse, different product, same subtle adjustment. This time his stomach tightened, because patterns like this rarely showed up by accident. Over the next several weeks, Evan started keeping quiet notes. Nothing official, nothing dramatic, just small cross-checks saved in a private folder on his laptop. He told himself he was being cautious, not suspicious. But the longer he watched the reports, the more the pressure built under his ribs. Someone was smoothing numbers. Not enough to trigger alarms, just enough to make quarterly performance look cleaner than the raw logs suggested. By month 5, sleep was getting harder. Some nights he lay in his small apartment listening to the hum of the refrigerator and wondering if he was about to make the same mistake twice in one career. Speak up too early and you look reckless. Stay quiet too long and you become part of the problem. There was no safe option, only timing. And now, sitting in the conference room 6 months later with every eye on him and the screen finally awake, Evan could feel the weight of every late-night decision pressing down on his shoulders. Because this was the moment where quiet caution stopped protecting you and started demanding proof. The numbers sat on the screen like they had been waiting for this exact moment. Bright, clear, impossible to ignore, Evan did not speak right away. His fingers rested lightly on the edge of the laptop, but inside, his pulse was hammering hard enough to make his vision feel slightly too sharp. Across the table, Mark Ellison leaned forward. Just a fraction. The shift was small, but it broke the easy confidence he had been wearing since the meeting began. "Walk us through what we are looking at," Mark said. Still calm, still controlled, but not relaxed anymore. Evan swallowed once and forced himself to focus on the data instead of the heat creeping up his neck. The warehouse scan for the Phoenix Distribution Center shows 3,842 units received on March 12, he began. He kept his voice level, though he could feel the tightness sitting in his chest. The quarterly report reflects 4,100 units for the same shipment window. A quiet ripple moved around the table. Someone near the end finally stopped pretending to type. Mark's gaze stayed locked on the screen. "That could be a timing delay," he said smoothly. "Late scan reconciliation happens." It was a reasonable answer. Too reasonable. For half a second, the old doubt pushed back into Evan's ribs. This was the dangerous part. Not when someone attacked your numbers. When they explained them calmly. Because calm explanations made you question your own footing. Evan forced himself to keep going. "I thought the same thing at first," he said, "so I checked the adjustment logs." He tapped the trackpad. The screen shifted to the next panel. A small timestamp column appeared on the right. The room leaned in again. There was no dramatic reaction. No gasps, just that subtle corporate silence that meant people were actually paying attention now. The adjustment entry was made 2 days later, Evan continued. But the warehouse intake records do not show any additional physical receipt during that window. Mark's jaw tightened. Barely visible. Most people in the room probably missed it. Evan did not. For the first time since the meeting began, something uneasy flickered behind Mark's eyes. Still, the manager kept his voice even. One discrepancy does not indicate a systemic issue. Another reasonable statement. Another careful push. Evan felt the pressure rise again. This was where most junior analysts backed off. Presented one concern. Got a smooth answer. Let the room move on. His throat felt dry again, because part of him still wanted to retreat, still wanted to sit down, apologize for the noise, and go back to being invisible. That part of him was loud, but the late nights were louder. He clicked again. 3 more entries appeared, different dates, different product lines, same pattern, quiet adjustments that pushed totals upward after the fact. Now the silence in the room changed shape. It grew heavier, more focused. Mark's fingers, which had been resting loosely on the table earlier, slowly came together. When he spoke again, his tone was still measured, but the warmth was gone. "Where did you pull these cross-checks from?" Not angry, but sharper. Evan felt the question land in his stomach, because this was the edge. Pushed too hard, and you looked like you were building a case. Not hard enough, and the moment slipped away. "From the raw warehouse export and the quarterly archive," Evan said carefully. "Both are standard access." Another pause stretched across the table. Somewhere near the window, a chair shifted softly. Mark leaned back slowly now, studying Evan in a way that felt very different from earlier. More alert, more calculating. "You spent a lot of time on this," he said. It was not praise. Evan's fingers tightened slightly against the laptop edge. "Long enough to notice a pattern," he answered. For a brief second, something unreadable passed across Mark's face. Then the manager's expression smoothed again. Professional. Controlled. But the room had already changed. The easy dismissal was gone. And for the first time since Evan walked into the meeting, it no longer felt like he was the only one under pressure. The silence after Evan's last sentence did not feel neutral. It felt loaded. Like the air in the room had thickened just enough to make everyone aware something had shifted. Mark Ellison did not speak right away. He sat back in his chair, fingers loosely steepled near his chin, studying the screen with the careful attention of someone recalculating in real time. Evan kept his posture still, but inside the adrenaline had not settled. His heartbeat was still too fast. His palms still slightly damp against the cool edge of the laptop. This was the dangerous middle ground. He had not been dismissed, but he had not been validated either. Mark finally exhaled slowly. "All right," he said. "Let us assume for a moment these adjustments are accurate." The wording landed carefully. Not agreement, not denial. A controlled step forward. Evan felt a small knot tighten under his ribs. Mark's gaze lifted from the screen and locked directly onto him. "What exactly are you suggesting, Evan?" There it was. The question everyone in the room had been avoiding. Because numbers were safe, implications were not. For half a second, Evan hesitated. Not visibly, but inside, the hesitation was sharp and immediate. Because this was the point where analysts got labeled. Careful, difficult, not a team fit. His sister's voice from years ago flashed briefly in his head during one of those late-night phone calls after Denver. Just do your job and keep your head down this time. The memory made his jaw tighten. He forced himself to breathe slowly before answering. "I am suggesting the reported intake totals may have been manually adjusted after the fact without corresponding physical receipts." The room went very still. Someone near the far wall shifted in their chair. Mark's expression did not change, but something colder settled behind his eyes. "That is a serious implication," he said quietly. Evan nodded once. Yes. No retreat now. Mark leaned forward again, elbows resting lightly on the table. "Do you have evidence of intent?" The question came smoothly, professionally, and it hit exactly where it was designed to. Evan's stomach dropped, because there it was. The gap. He had patterns. He had inconsistencies. But intent was another level entirely. For the first time since the screen lit up, real uncertainty pushed hard against his composure. His fingers tightened slightly, not visible to most, but enough that he felt it. "I have evidence of repeated manual adjustments that do not align with physical intake logs," Evan said carefully. Carefully. Too carefully. Mark's head tilted just slightly, but you cannot demonstrate why those adjustments were made. Not a question. A narrowing. The room felt like it leaned back a fraction. This was the moment where credibility could slip. Evan could feel it happening in real time. His chest tightened. Because the honest answer was uncomfortable. Not yet. The words sat heavy behind his teeth. For a brief second, he considered softening it, framing it differently. But something stubborn and tired inside him pushed back. "Not yet," Evan admitted. The silence that followed was sharp, not explosive, not dramatic, just the quiet corporate sound of risk increasing. Mark leaned back slowly again, and this time, the faint curve at the corner of his mouth returned. Measured. Careful. "You understand," he said, voice smooth again, "that raising partial concerns in a board prep meeting carries consequences." There it was, the first real pressure. Not loud, but unmistakable. Evan felt heat creep back into his face, because beneath the calm words was the message every junior employee learns to hear. You are stepping into territory you may not control. For a brief second, the old fear came rushing back full force. The cardboard box, the polite security escort, starting over again. His throat tightened, and for the first time since this meeting began, his confidence wavered where everyone could almost see it. Almost. Then something unexpected happened. On the edge of the projected screen, a small notification window blinked to life. Quiet, unplanned, but impossible to ignore. Evan's eyes flicked toward it instinctively, and the moment he read the subject line, the tight pressure in his chest shifted into something else entirely. The notification should have been easy to ignore, just a small corner alert on the projected screen. The kind most people swipe away without thinking. But the subject line hit Evan like cold water. Warehouse reconciliation follow-up, sent 5 minutes ago. His pulse jumped. For half a second, he did not breathe. Across the table, Mark was still talking. Voice smooth and controlled, continuing his careful pressure about partial concerns and board readiness. But Evan was no longer fully hearing him, because the sender name had just come into focus. Dana Ruiz, Senior Warehouse Supervisor, Phoenix Distribution Center. Evan's stomach tightened hard. Dana almost never emailed during executive review windows. She was precise about timing, careful, quietly professional in the way people became after years inside logistics systems, which meant this was not routine. Mark's voice cut back into focus. "If there are no further substantiated..." Evan lifted his hand slightly. Not dramatic, just enough to interrupt. "Sorry," Evan said, and this time his voice carried a thin edge he could not completely hide. A new reconciliation note just came in from the Phoenix floor. The room stilled again. Mark's eyes narrowed a fraction. Now the manager was paying very close attention. Evan clicked the notification. The email opened, short, direct, no greeting, no soft language. Flagging this before the board pull. Manual override entries for March batch were not initiated by warehouse team. Please advise Dana. For one long second, nobody spoke. The words sat there on the bright screen, plain and clinical and quietly explosive. Evan felt something complicated move through his chest. Relief, sharp and sudden, followed immediately by something heavier, because this was no longer just a pattern. This was confirmation from the floor. Across the table, Mark's posture had changed again. Not dramatically, but the easy confidence was gone now. His fingers came together slowly on the tabletop. When he spoke, his voice was still controlled, but the warmth had cooled several degrees. "When exactly did this come in?" "5 minutes ago," Evan said. He kept his tone neutral, but his pulse was still running too fast. The room had fully shifted now. No one was pretending to type. No one was looking at their phones. Every eye was on the screen. Mark's gaze stayed locked on the email for a long moment. Then he leaned back slowly. "It could still be a misunderstanding at the warehouse level," he said. Reasonable, measured. But it no longer landed the same way, because the floor had just pushed back. Evan felt the weight of the moment pressing in from all sides. This was where things could escalate fast, or get quietly buried. His mouth felt dry again, but the old hesitation was weaker now. "Dana's team handles physical intake only," Evan said carefully. "They would not have visibility into post-report adjustments unless something flagged internally." Another silence, thicker this time. Mark's jaw tightened. Barely, but enough. For the first time since the meeting began, the balance in the room no longer leaned clearly in one direction, and Evan could feel it. That fragile, dangerous moment when quiet confidence starts to crack. For the first time that morning, the silence in the conference room no longer belonged to Mark. It hung in the air differently now. Heavier, more uncertain. Evan could feel it in the way people had stopped shifting in their chairs, in the way laptop screens sat forgotten, in the way the air itself seemed to pause between breaths. Mark Ellison's fingers rested flat against the table. No more tapping, no more easy rhythm, just stillness. He read Dana's email again, slowly, carefully. Evan forced himself to stay quiet. This part mattered. Push too soon and he would look over-eager. Stay too passive and the moment might slide away. His heart was still beating too fast, but underneath the nerves, something steadier had begun to settle in his chest. Not confidence, not yet, but traction. Mark finally looked up. His expression had smoothed back into something professional, but the ease from earlier had not fully returned. "How many entries show this pattern?" he asked. The question landed clean. Direct, no longer dismissive. Evan exhaled slowly through his nose and turned the laptop slightly so the full table could see. 4 confirmed across 2 reporting windows, he said, with 2 additional variances still under review. A soft shift moved through the room. Not loud, but noticeable. Someone near the end of the table leaned forward. Mark's gaze flicked across the screen again, scanning the timestamps, the adjustment fields, the quiet trail of numbers that had looked so harmless just an hour earlier. And then, something small but important happened. He stopped arguing the data. Instead, he changed angles. "Who else have you shared this with?" The words came calm, neutral. But Evan felt the question hit deeper than the ones before it. Because this was not about numbers. This was about containment. For half a second, the old instinct flared again. The one that told him to minimize, to soften, to make himself smaller in the room. But that instinct had already cost him once in his career. He did not follow it this time. Only Dana at the warehouse level in this review group, Evan said. Truthful, measured. Mark held his gaze for a long moment. Too long to be casual. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another degree. "I see," Mark said quietly. He leaned back in his chair again, but the posture no longer carried the same relaxed authority. There was calculation there now. Quick mental movement behind controlled eyes. Evan noticed, so did at least 2 other people at the table. The balance was shifting, not dramatically, but enough. Mark folded his hands loosely. "Walk me through your review process," he said. On the surface, it sounded procedural, routine, but Evan could hear what sat underneath it. Prove you did not overstep. Prove this is clean. His pulse ticked up again, but his voice stayed steady. I began with standard quarterly reconciliation, he said. When the first variance appeared, I cross-checked against raw warehouse exports and preserved timestamp logs before running pattern comparisons across the last 2 reporting cycles. He kept his tone calm. No defensiveness, no edge, just process. Across the table, one of the senior analysts gave a small, almost involuntary nod. Mark noticed that too. A faint line appeared between his brows. Evan continued. All files remain within standard access permissions. No restricted pulls. Another quiet beat passed through the room. This time, the silence felt different. More people were leaning toward the data now instead of away from it. Mark's jaw flexed once, barely visible. But the shift was real. For the first time since the meeting began, the room was no longer automatically aligned behind him. Evan felt the moment settle into place. Fragile, unstable, but real. Mark exhaled slowly through his nose. All right, he said at last. 2 simple words, but they carried weight. Because they were not dismissal, they were not approval. They were the sound of a man realizing the situation had just become more complicated than he planned. And somewhere, deep in Evan's chest, the tight knot that had been there all morning loosened just slightly. Not victory, not yet, but the room had officially stopped assuming he was bluffing. The word, all right, still hung faintly in the air. Not agreement, not surrender, but no longer dismissal. Evan felt it settle into the room like a weight-shifting position, subtle but unmistakable, the kind of shift that only happens when certainty starts to fracture. Across the table, Mark Ellison reached for his water glass and took a slow sip, buying time, recalibrating. Evan recognized the move because he had done the same thing himself during late-night solo reviews when numbers did not make sense. Pause. Breathe. Reframe the problem. When Mark set the glass down, his voice returned to that measured corporate calm. Let us be precise here. The room leaned in again. You're identifying a pattern of manual adjustments that may not align with warehouse intake activity, Mark continued. But at this stage, you are not asserting deliberate misconduct. The phrasing was careful. Very careful. Evan felt the edge inside it immediately. This was positioning. If Evan pushed too hard, he would look reckless. If he softened too much, the concern could be quietly boxed and shelved. For a brief second, the familiar pressure crept back into his chest. This was where people lost momentum. Not in the big, dramatic moments. In the careful wording. In the corporate gray space where issues slowly dissolved. He chose his words with equal care. I am asserting the pattern warrants immediate verification before board review, Evans said. Neutral, controlled, but firm enough that it did not retreat. Mark's eyes stayed locked on him for a long moment. Then the manager gave a small nod that could have meant several different things. And that is exactly what we are doing now. Smooth, reasonable, and just slippery enough to redirect ownership of the situation. Evan felt it. Mark was not pushing back directly anymore. He was absorbing the moment, containing it. Across the table, one of the finance leads finally spoke, voice cautious. Have we checked whether any automated reconciliation scripts ran during those windows? The question landed like a stone dropped into still water, because it introduced a new possibility. Not human, not intentional, just system noise. Evan's stomach tightened again. This was the kind of off-ramp that could quietly dissolve everything if he was not careful. I reviewed the automation logs for the affected dates, Evans said. No scheduled scripts correspond to those manual override timestamps. He clicked once more. The automation panel appeared. Clean, empty for those windows. The finance lead leaned closer to the screen. Mark did not move, but something in his posture had gone very still. Too still. Then Mark spoke again, voice lower now. Who approved the manual overrides? There it was, the real question. Not about patterns, not about process, about ownership. Evan felt his pulse spike once, sharp and immediate. Because he had seen that field. Had noticed it during the second late-night review when the office lights had dimmed automatically around him. He had not wanted to jump to conclusions then. Had told himself to verify first. To be careful. But the name had not changed. Across 4 separate entries. Evan's fingers rested lightly on the trackpad. For the first time since the meeting began, a thin line of tension pulled across his shoulders again. Because the next click would change the temperature in this room completely. He inhaled slowly, then turned to the screen, and opened the approval column. The approval column filled the center of the screen. Clean rows, neat timestamps, and one name repeating down the list like it had nowhere else to hide. Evan did not speak. He did not need to. The room read it for themselves. For half a second, nothing moved. The kind of frozen stillness that happens when a group of professionals all reach the same uncomfortable realization at the exact same time. Then a chair near the far wall shifted softly. Mark Ellison did not look at the screen immediately. He looked at Evan, slowly, carefully, as if measuring something new. When he finally turned his attention to the display, his expression remained controlled, but the air around him had changed. The easy executive composure from earlier was gone. In its place sat something tighter, more alert. The name on the approvals did not belong to Evan. It did not belong to Dana, it belonged to Victor Hale, Senior Operations Controller. 2 levels above Evan, 1 level below Mark. Evan felt his pulse in his throat again. Not panic this time, pressure. Because this was the line he had been trying not to cross too early. Mark's fingers came together slowly on the table. How many times does this appear? He asked. His voice stayed level, but the question carried weight now. 4 confirmed instances, Evan said. 2 additional under review. Across the table, someone let out a quiet breath they probably meant to keep silent. Victor Hale was not a small name in this building. He had been here 9 years. Ran quarterly oversight for 3 regions. Known for being careful, methodical. The kind of person who rarely showed up in problems, which was exactly why the room now felt so tight. Mark leaned back slowly in his chair. For the first time since the meeting began, he did not immediately offer a counterpoint. He studied the screen again. Longer this time. Evan could feel every second of it, because this was the moment where the room would decide what kind of issue this was. Clerical, procedural, or something that needed to move higher. Finally, Mark spoke. Has anyone reached out to Victor directly? There was no accusation in his tone. But there was something else. Distance. Evan noticed it immediately. Not yet, Evan said. I wanted to verify the pattern first. Truthful, measured. Mark gave a slow nod. Reasonable. But the word landed flatter than it would have earlier. One of the senior analysts shifted forward. Do we know the context of those overrides? Another careful question. Another potential off-ramp. Evan felt the familiar pressure push lightly against his ribs again. Because context mattered, it always did. The entries are coded as manual reconciliation corrections, he said. But the warehouse intake records do not show matching physical adjustments for those dates. Silence again. Heavier now. Mark's jaw flexed once, barely visible, but this time several people in the room saw it. The balance had shifted again. Not dramatically, but enough that the earlier confidence was fully gone. Mark reached for his water again but did not drink. Just held the glass. Thinking. Calculating. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped half a degree. All right, 2 words, but very different from the earlier one. We are not drawing conclusions yet. Careful, controlled, containing, but no longer dismissive. Evan felt the subtle current running through the room. People were no longer waiting for him to be wrong. They were waiting to see how far this went. Mark set the water glass down slowly. We will need to verify these entries directly with Victor and audit the related batches before the board packet is finalized. Procedural language. But the meaning underneath was clear. This was no longer being brushed aside. Evan exhaled quietly through his nose. Not relief. Not victory. Because he could feel something else building under the surface now. A tension that had nothing to do with spreadsheets. Mark's eyes lifted from the screen and met his again. And for the first time that morning, there was no trace of amusement left in them. Only calculation. And something else. Something that looked very close to concern. No one in the room moved for several seconds after Mark finished speaking. Not the casual stillness from earlier. This one felt deliberate, measured. Like everyone understood the meeting had just crossed into territory that would not quietly disappear. Evan sat very still, hands resting near the laptop, forcing his breathing to stay slow even though the pressure in his chest had returned in a different form. He had wanted the data taken seriously, now it was, and the weight of that reality was settling in fast. Across the table, Mark Ellison's posture remained composed, but the subtle tells were no longer fully hidden. The slight tightness along his jaw, the way his fingers rested too flat against the table instead of loose and relaxed. He was thinking several moves ahead now. So was everyone else. One of the finance leads cleared her throat softly. "Do we have the March batch report pulled?" Her voice was careful, but there was no longer any attempt to minimize the issue. Mark gave a small nod. "Pull it." Evan moved quickly, fingers more steady now than they had been at the start of the meeting. The file opened across the projection screen. Rows of shipment data filled the display. Clean. Ordered. Normal at first glance. But now the room was looking differently. Not scanning, examining. Mark leaned forward slightly. "Show me the corresponding warehouse intake for the same window." Evan clicked again. The second panel appeared beside the first. 2 columns, 2 timelines, and the quiet gap sitting between them. Someone at the far end of the table exhaled under their breath. It was not dramatic, but it was enough. Mark's eyes moved slowly across both panels, then back again. Careful, methodical. The way someone reads when they are no longer trying to disprove the data, but trying to understand how far it spreads. "How contained is this?" he asked. The question landed heavier than the words suggested. Evan knew exactly what he meant. Scope, exposure, risk. Right now, the confirmed pattern touches 2 reporting cycles and 1 primary distribution channel, Evan said. He kept his voice even, but his stomach was tight again, because the honest answer was still developing, still moving, and that uncertainty lived right at the edge of the room. Mark's fingers tapped once against the table, just once. First time the rhythm had returned since the email appeared. "Expand the review to the previous 2 quarters," he said. Not a suggestion, a direction. The shift was unmistakable now. This was no longer a contained anomaly check. This was an expanding audit. Evan nodded once, already in progress. Mark's eyes flicked up again, studying him with a sharper focus than before. For a brief second, the room held its breath again, because something else had just changed. Evan was no longer being treated like the junior analyst who spoke out of turn. He was now the person holding the thread. And everyone in the room understood exactly how dangerous that position could become. Mark leaned back slowly. "Keep this within the review group for now," he said. Calm, controlled, but very intentional. Evan felt the meaning settle in immediately. Containment. Careful handling. Not silence, but not exposure either. The kind of corporate middle ground where outcomes were still being quietly shaped. Evan gave a small nod. Understood. But as the room settled into its new, heavier quiet, a thin unease slid back into his chest. Because something about Mark's tone in those last few seconds had shifted again. Subtle. Almost invisible. But enough to raise a quiet, uncomfortable thought in the back of Evan's mind. This situation was bigger than the numbers on the screen, and it was just starting to move. The meeting should have started winding down. That was the normal rhythm, flag hooking, preliminary review, action items assigned. Then everyone scattered back to their corners of the building, pretending their morning had not just shifted direction. But no one in the room reached for their laptop bags. No one closed their screens. The air had settled into something watchful. Evan sat very still, aware in a new way of how exposed his position had become. A few minutes ago, he'd just been the junior analyst raising an uncomfortable question. Now, he was attached to the thread everyone was staring at. That kind of visibility came with its own kind of risk. Across the table, Mark Ellison's expression had returned to something outwardly composed. If someone walked in cold, they might even think the meeting had gone exactly as planned. But the small details told a different story. Mark's shoulders sat a fraction tighter. His gaze moved more slowly between screens, and when he finally spoke again, his tone carried a new layer of precision. "Before we expand further, I want to clarify process boundaries." The words were neutral, procedural, but Evan felt the shift immediately. This was not about the data anymore. This was about control. Mark's eyes settled on him. "You pulled all source material through standard analyst permissions." Not a question. A verification. Evan nodded once. "Yes." His voice stayed calm, but the familiar pressure had returned low in his chest. He understood what was happening now. The room was no longer just evaluating the numbers. They were quietly evaluating him. Mark continued. "No restricted system access. No after-hours credential elevation." Each phrase landed carefully, each one drawing a clean line around responsibility. Evan kept his posture steady, correct. A brief pause followed. Mark leaned back slightly, studying him in that same measured way from earlier, but without the earlier dismissal. "Good," he said. One word. But the room heard the subtext. The data trail was not compromised, which meant the issue, wherever it ultimately pointed, could not be dismissed as a junior analyst overstepping access. Evan felt something small and tight inside his chest loosen. Not relief, but confirmation. One of the finance leads finally spoke again. "Should we notify internal audit at this stage?" The question landed softly but carried weight. Mark did not answer immediately. Instead, he folded his hands and looked down at the table for a long second, thinking, calculating. When he finally looked up, his expression was carefully neutral again. Not yet. The room went very still. Mark continued calmly. "We verify scope first. If this remains contained to reconciliation noise, we avoid unnecessary escalation. reasonable, professional. But Evan felt a thin thread of tension slide down his spine, because the phrase unnecessary escalation had edges, soft ones, but edges all the same. Across the table, two of the senior analysts exchanged the briefest glance. Quick, subtle, but not invisible. Mark's gaze returned to Evan. Continue your expanded review. Flag anything that broadens the pattern immediately. Evan nodded once. Understood. The meeting finally began to shift then. Chairs moved slightly. Someone closed a laptop halfway, but the energy in the room had permanently changed. As people began quietly gathering their notes, Evan felt the weight of something new settling onto his shoulders. He had pushed the numbers into the light. That part was done. Now came the harder phase. Watching what the room decided to do with them. And as Mark stood slowly at the head of the table, his expression composed but unreadable, one quiet realization pressed firmly into the back of Evan's mind. The situation was no longer just about whether the data was wrong. It was about who would be most uncomfortable if it turned out to be right. The room began to empty in slow, careful stages. Not the usual end of meeting shuffle. No casual side conversations, no light jokes about deadlines. People left in that controlled corporate way that meant everyone was still thinking too hard. Evan stayed seated a few seconds longer than necessary, watching the reflection of the overhead lights in the dark surface of the conference table. His pulse had finally started to slow, but the tightness in his chest had not fully gone away. If anything, it had changed shape. Across the room, Mark Ellison gathered his tablet and notes with precise movements. No rush, no visible irritation, just quiet efficiency. Too quiet. Evan recognized the feeling immediately. This was not over. One of the senior analysts passed behind Evan's chair and paused briefly. Good catch. The words were low, neutral, but genuine. Evan gave a small nod. Thanks. The analyst moved on without another word, but the brief acknowledgement settled strangely in Evan's chest. 6 months in this department, and most days he still felt like background noise. Today he had been impossible to ignore. That came with weight. When Evan finally stood, the conference room was nearly empty. Only Mark remained near the far end of the table, reviewing something on his tablet. For half a second, Evan considered slipping out quietly. Keeping his head down, letting the moment cool, it would have been the safer move. But something in the room's earlier tension still sat under his ribs, pushing. So he stepped forward. Mark. The manager looked up immediately. Not surprised, as if he had expected Evan might linger. Yes. Up close, the difference in Mark's expression was more visible. Still controlled, still professional. But the earlier ease had not returned. Evan kept his voice measured. I will have the expanded review ready by tomorrow afternoon. Mark studied him for a moment. Long enough to feel intentional, make it morning. The correction came smoothly. No edge, but not casual either. Evan nodded once. Understood. For a second, neither of them spoke. The quiet stretched just long enough to feel like something else might follow. Then Mark set his tablet down slowly. You handled the room carefully today, he said. It was not quite praise, not quite warning. Evan felt his shoulders tighten slightly. I stuck to the data. Mark's mouth moved almost into a smile, but it stopped halfway. Yes, you did. Another pause. Then Mark added, voice calm but more direct than anything he'd said in the meeting. Just be sure you understand the difference between identifying noise and creating unnecessary turbulence. There it was. Soft, professional, but unmistakable. Evan felt the words land in his stomach. Because beneath the calm delivery sat the real message. know where the lines are. For a brief second, the old uncertainty pushed forward again. The memory of Denver, the cardboard box, the polite corporate tone that always sounded reasonable right up until it was not. But something in Evan had shifted over the last hour. Not confidence, not defiance, just clarity. "I understand the difference," Evan said quietly. Mark held his gaze, searching, measuring. Then he gave one slow nod and picked up his tablet again. Good. Conversation over, or at least paused. Evan turned and walked toward the door, the low hum of the office floor already bleeding back into the hallway outside. But as he stepped into the corridor, something small caught his attention. Through the glass wall of the conference room, he saw Mark's reflection in the dark monitor. The manager was no longer looking at his tablet. He was staring directly at the approval column still frozen on the screen. And his jaw was set tighter than it had been all morning. Evan kept walking, but the uneasy weight in his chest had returned full force, because one thing was suddenly very clear. The numbers had not just created a problem, they had made someone in that room very uncomfortable. And tomorrow morning was coming fast. By 6:43 a.m. the next morning, Evan was already at his desk. The office lights had only just flicked on. The air still carried that early morning quiet that made every keyboard tap sound louder than it should. His coffee sat untouched beside the laptop, slowly cooling. He had not slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, the same thoughts kept circling back. Victor Hale, manual overrides, and Mark's voice from yesterday, calm but edged. Know the difference between noise and turbulence? Evan exhaled slowly and pulled up the expanded review files. If there was anything else buried in the data, today it would surface. He started with the previous quarter. Then the one before that. Line by line. Timestamp by timestamp. The pattern did not explode outward the way part of him had feared. It moved more carefully than that, which somehow made it worse. By 7:12 a.m., he had confirmed 2 additional variances. Smaller adjustments. Same approval name. Same quiet timing after initial intake windows. Evan leaned back slowly in his chair. 5 confirmed now. Not random, not isolated. Intent still unproven. But the pattern had teeth. His phone buzzed lightly against the desk. Unknown internal extension. For half a second, his stomach tightened. He answered. "Evan." Victor Hale's voice came through smooth and composed. "Morning. I hear you've been reviewing some reconciliation noise tied to my approval queue. No greeting, no wasted space." Evan sat a little straighter. "Yes." Expanding the variance review as requested. A brief pause hummed on the line. Victor spoke again. "Walk me through what you think you are seeing." Not defensive, not irritated. Just very, very controlled. Evan chose his words carefully. There are repeated manual adjustments following intake windows that do not appear to correspond with physical warehouse updates. Silence, long enough to notice. Then Victor exhaled softly. Those entries were part of a legacy smoothing process during high-volume cycles. Nothing irregular. The explanation came clean, prepared, too prepared. Evan's fingers rested lightly on the edge of his desk. "Do we have documentation for that process?" he asked. Another pause. "Shorter this time. We do. I will have my team forward it." Click. The line went dead. Evan stared at his phone for a long second. Something about that call sat wrong in his chest. Not the words. The timing. Too fast. Too aware. He turned back to the screen and flagged the new findings. By 8:20 a.m., Mark had called for a follow-up review. The smaller conference room this time, tighter, more contained. When Evan entered, Mark and Victor were already seated across from each other. Victor Hale looked exactly like his reputation suggested. Mid-50s, immaculate suit, calm eyes that missed very little. He gave Evan a polite nod as he sat. Morning, Evan returned it. Mark wasted no time. Walk us through the expanded review. Evan turned the laptop toward them and began. He kept his voice steady. Process focused, clinical. 5 confirmed variances now. Same pattern, same approval source. Victor listened without interruption, fingers loosely folded on the table. When Evan finished, the room went quiet. Victor spoke first. As I mentioned on the phone, these were part of legacy smoothing during peak load reporting. The warehouse often lags during surge cycles. Mark's eyes shifted to Evan. Documentation. Evan opened the folder Victor's team had forwarded 15 minutes earlier, short, neatly formatted, and missing one critical piece. His stomach tightened. There is no active authorization trail tied to this process in the last 2 reporting years, Evan said carefully. The room stilled. Victor's gaze sharpened just slightly. Mark leaned forward. Explain. Evan clicked to the audit timeline. The legacy process was formally retired 18 months ago during the reporting compliance update. Any manual smoothing after that point would require new authorization. I am not seeing that authorization attached to these entries. Silence dropped hard across the table. For the first time, Victor's fingers stopped moving. Not dramatically, but enough. Mark's voice came lower now. Victor. A long breath left Victor's nose. Measured, controlled. Those entries were transitional carryovers during the system changeover window. Reasonable on the surface, but the confidence had thinned. Evan did not speak. He did not need to. The timestamps were already on the screen. Months after the transition window closed. Mark saw it. The shift in his posture was subtle but unmistakable. We will need formal internal audit review, Mark said quietly. No one argued, not even Victor. The meeting ended without raised voices, without confrontation, just quiet corporate gravity settling into place. Later that afternoon, Evan sat back at his desk as the office noise slowly returned to normal around him. Internal audit had been notified. The files were preserved. The process was moving. Not explosive, but real. He stared for a long moment at the original mismatch that had started everything. Just one line of numbers that had felt slightly off on a quiet Tuesday night. His coffee had gone completely cold now. Across the floor, Mark stepped out of his office and paused briefly, meeting Evan's eyes from a distance. No smile, no warning. Just a slow, measured nod. Then he walked on. Evan leaned back in his chair and finally let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for 2 straight days. This was not victory. Not yet. In corporate systems, nothing ever moved that cleanly. But one thing was certain now. No one in that building thought he had been bluffing, and somewhere deep in the reporting system, the screen was still lit. If this story pulled you in, you are exactly who this channel is for. Final text is where quiet moments turn into real consequences, where small details change everything, and where the truth never stays buried for long. Subscribe now so you do not miss the next story. And tell me in the comments, at what moment did you realize Evan was not bluffing?